color image of the shroud, but glass plates in 1898 didn't make color images. They were strictly black and white. So although his eye saw this, his camera and his film saw this. Photographic negatives invert the lights and darks of the image. So what's on the shroud, in effect, is somewhat like a negative, because when you invert the lights and darks, then you get this result. And let's make it easier to look at. Let's stand the man vertically and look at half the shroud at a time. Now you can clearly see the man standing before you, and you can see how subtle the image is on the left there, but on the right, you can see the man standing clearly out. You can see his face. You can see the swollen cheekbones. So let's go down the list of things that we can see on the shroud, starting with blood stains at the top of the head from a cap or crown of thorns. Now, historically through Christian art, they show a little laurel wreath-like thing of thorns. And that's because in the ancient days, when they depicted a Roman emperor or somebody of high stature, they always put a laurel wreath around his head. So Christian artists over the centuries, based on the shroud, adopted that when they did an artwork depicting the crown of thorns. But you can imagine that they didn't make some Roman soldier weave a pretty little crown to put on this person's head that they were about to execute. They took a thorn bush and they smashed it on his head. And we can say that clearly from the shroud because the blood stains on his scalp cover the entire scalp, not just in a little circlet, but entire scalp. You can clearly see the face with the swollen cheekbones. You can see one cheekbone more swollen than the other. You can see his nose. You can see the split beard. And if you go look at the prophecies in the Old Testament, they talked about when the Messiah comes, they would pluck his beard, which first of all tells us he had a beard. And secondly, you can see a V-notch that looks like a chunk of the beard has been pulled out on the shroud. So it's not only consistent with the modern Gospels, it's also consistent with the Old Testament prophecies. Continuing down, and this is important, if you look closely, you'll see scourge marks on the front of the body, all the way down to the ankles. Now, historically, Christian artists have always depicted the scourging of Jesus with his back shredded. But if you're standing behind somebody with a three-thonged leather whip with lead balls on the end of it, if you get just a tiny bit closer to the body, they're going to come around, they're going to hit the front of the body and damage the front of the body as well. Christian artists have never depicted it that way, but that's what's on the shroud. So it's more forensically accurate than any of the artworks ever done depicting the same event. Continuing down, that line under the chin, by the way, is simply a crease in the cloth. You can see that a little more clearly here on the left under the chin. They used to roll the shroud up on a dowel and put it in a wooden box, which is not really good from a fire safety point of view. And so it caused creases to get pressed into the cloth, and that was one of them. There was also one above the forehead, but we were able to smooth that one out when we set up the shroud to photograph it. Consequently, only the one under the chin is visible. But when you convert the image to a black and white image, like we see on the right, and invert the lights and darks, that's a much more natural looking result than the original on the left. And when Secundo Pia, who made that first photograph, presented this to the public, he was immediately accused of fraud. Now, I have to kind of interject at this moment that when I talk about a photographic negative, today, anybody about under the age of 40 doesn't know what the heck I'm talking about because film has become obsolete. So trying to explain the shroud as a photographic negative itself and what it looks like on a photo made of that image gets more and more difficult to explain as the years go by. I had a 10-year-old kid ask me if film was a USB device, which makes sense for a 10-year-old. But this is the limitation that we have. Now, continuing on, we have a blood stain here in the side or side wound from a spear, and you can see a blood flow from it. These triangular shaped patches came from the damage caused by a fire in 1532, and the Poor Clare sisters repaired it, sewed in these patches, and sewed a backing sheet onto the shroud to add stability because it had been weakened by the fire damage. So those triangular patches that you see are not part of the original shroud, but they were added in 1534 to protect it, preserve it, and repair it from the damage caused by the fire. Now, you can see a wound in the wrist. You can see it a little more clearly here. You can see the blood flowed down the arms. So you can see, again, these have been studied by forensic pathologists, medical doctors. These are all authentic blood stains that could only get on the shroud by direct physical contact. That's different than the image because there's image on the shroud where there wasn't direct physical contact, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. There's some more of those patches, and because of the fire in 1532 here, you can see a big diamond-shaped water stain, another one here, another one over on this side, another one up here. These water stains came from the efforts to put the fire out in 1532 that was damaging the shroud. But they were not part of the original shroud, nor are they part of the image. And because of capillarity, any dust and dirt and debris in the cloth was carried to the edges of those water stains. And believe it or not, those water stains registered on the